Super obrigada pela presença de vocês. Daremos agora início às continuidade das nossas atividades de programas públicos, com a segunda mesa do Seminário Lugares e Sentidos na Arte, debates a partir do Sul. Já vou passar a palavra para a Sabrina Moura, que é curadora e mediadora desse seminário. Mas antes, só para deixar claro, o lançamento do livro Perspectivas para Novas Geografias do Pensamento vai acontecer em seguida a essa mesa, aqui às 4h30, no foyer do teatro. Então, todos convidados. A Sabrina, ao final da mesa, vai falar um pouquinho para a gente do processo de realização desse livro. A gente vai fazer, a mesa vai acontecer, teremos inglês e português, então, quem precisar de fone para tradução, quem não pegou, tem aqui na entrada do teatro, tá bom?
Okay, so I'm going to make the introduction in English so that all of you can understand as well, so it can facilitate our communication. So thank you very much for being here on the second roundtable discussion of the seminars. The first one happened on the 7th, 3 days ago, when we discussed the idea of contemporary art and how it could be expanded. The second one is today, of course, and then we have 2 more during the month of October. The third happens on the 22nd, and the last one on the 29th. So the idea for the seminars, although the themes seem to be as broad as they are, you know, discussing history or contemporarity, daily life, the idea was really to create a large field for us to explore and kind of be able to contain and let the works speak, and also the debates bring out more specific themes. And I think that the main idea mainly was to kind of discuss not production of the South, but taking the South as a starting point, taking the idea of the South as a situation. So this is why the name of the festivals is Debates from the South and not of the South. So I think this is a very important, it's very important to contextualize. Our discussion today, it's not new in the field of the contemporary art. I mean, there has been a lot of discussion on this theme, you know, the idea of art and daily life, the uses of art, or how the institutional settings for art can be expanded. But taking from the perspective of the works that are shown in the festival, and especially the non-Western production, we thought that many interesting axes could come out from the works shown here. So this is why we kind of invited participants with different backgrounds. So we have Keli Maksud, who is an artist. We have Berhanu Ashagrie, who works as a director of an art school in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. We have Till Fellrath, who runs and collaborates with Sam Badawill at the collective Art Reoriented and discusses the frameworks of art history and the expansion of the idea of art through questioning themes like modernism and, you know, reframing the perspectives of contemporary art. And also we have Hoor, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, which is Al-Qasimi, and she's director of the Sharjah Art Foundation. And I'm sure they will contribute with very, very different perspectives for today. So I pass the word to Keli. Thank you.
Hi. So I thought that I would base my discussion on these fabrics that I'm using in my installation, which is up at Galpao, and just talk about sort of the performativity that embody them once they're put on by the local communities, and how they're continuously sort of communicating something, and, you know, obviously in public spaces. Do I? Yes. Where am I pressing? So the installation that I'm working on is using fabrics known as Dutch wax. They're made by a company in the Netherlands called Vlisco. This is something that's been happening since the 19th century. And right now, they sit in a place where we can really say that they are kind of African, but there's also this history that's sort of removed, considering that they're being made in the Netherlands. But I think it's interesting to talk about how they assimilate into local cultures. Specifically, I'm framing this around West African cultures because this is where they were originally being exported to. In East Africa, where I'm from, like, this is something that's happened very recently, and we have a completely different way of interacting with these fabrics, which is really more contemporary fashion. So I thought that I would basically just look at fabrics in general and the role of fabrics historically. This is an image from the Fanti women in Ghana. They're wearing all kinds of different fabrics that are locally or maybe more indigenous to Ghana. But the symbology behind them and the pattern is communicating something. And I think, too, you can see that there's also Western influence from the shirts that they're wearing. I'll just move forward. Okay. So when Vlisco started making these fabrics and bringing them into the African market, what they were bringing was stuff that was very floral, with animals, something that they just thought was universally thought of as beautiful, but this was very Western image for many African people. So what Vlisco started doing is looking at some of the indigenous fabrics that are found in different regions. This one is specifically from Ghana, and actually taking the symbols and incorporating them into the Dutch wax fabrics. And I think that this was really important for the fabrics then entering like the community and sort of having some kind of meaning behind them. So just to give a few examples of, looking at the different symbols. I'm not pressing anything, it's just going. Also looking at, this is from Nigeria. And I think that it's important to understand that, like, we don't necessarily, even for me, who's from the continent, I won't understand all the symbology, and all of this is so closely linked to specific cultures, specific tribes, specific languages. So, it might mean something completely different for somebody who's from Mali versus somebody who's from Nigeria, because the symbology is completely different. This is just an example of how they're tie-dyeing these fabrics. And, this is an image sort of like also trying to show you where some of the stuff that's in my exhibition is actually coming from and referencing. So this is a prime example of a resist dye that is in Ghana. And I think that this is one of the examples where I could really see how Vlisco has taken, especially from one of the earlier images that I showed you, they've really taken something that was symbolically from the Adinkra fabrics that we're making, and looking just at, the symbol of the eye, and of course that has all these different connotations and meanings. We also have, there's also the kente cloth, and I think that like the kente cloth is really working with proverbs, and naming this fabric is what actually gives it meaning in the communities. And again, some of these patterns, you see them in the Dutch wax fabrics. And, this is the big machine of Vlisco. So it's important to talk about the role of women when it comes to these fabrics, because they're really the ones who are actually receiving the shipments, and they are the ones who take on the role of naming the fabrics once they arrive. So these fabrics which are coming from the Netherlands will arrive to like the different markets. The women look at the patterns and give it a name, and through that naming, that's where the symbology really comes from. And also just like I think historically, like women have been at the forefront of like distributing these fabrics across the continent. So coming in through mostly like Ghana, Nigeria, and then spreading them into as far as the Congo and, you know, some parts of East Africa, but I think this is something that's a bit recent. And, you know, just also looking at these marketplaces as like this public space where, for me, this is very much an exhibition of these fabrics and how they decide to lay them out, and, you know, the naming of it and stuff is something that I think is really functioning in public spaces across the continent. So there's also these, again, like looking at like women as the main distributors. They were actually from like the 1930s, I think specifically in Togo. They started to refer to these women as Nana Bens, and they have shrines dedicated to them because they actually ended up like accumulating quite a bit of wealth just through the distribution of fabrics, to the point where they were the only ones who could afford Mercedes-Benz, thus the name Nana Benz. And, you know, they were richer even than the government sometimes. And they started collaborating then with the government and actually like really contributed quite highly to the economies of different regions. So there's throughout, I think specifically in Togo that I've seen this, where they have these shrines dedicated to these women who really uplifted the economy at some point in history. I mean, specifically between the 1930s and 1950s. So yeah, just again looking at the public realm of how these cloths function, specifically in markets. And I think too, like when I think about my works and how, you know, it's been put up within a gallery space. But I think that if this installation was in a marketplace, you know, it would also resonate with the communities there, because you know, maybe from the choice of fabrics that I've decided to use and the specific meanings that they might have behind them. But I think it's also, it would be something that they would really be able to recognize, whether they're having some kind of arts education or background. There's just a different way to, what's the word? Just to interact with these fabrics. And I think, you know, within the gallery space, it does become quite different depending on, you know, sort of what the viewer is bringing and their understanding of these fabrics. You know, a lot of people outside of the continent, I think, react to the work that I do as maybe something about Afro pride. But, you know, I think because the symbology outside of the continent with these specific fabrics becomes more about a connection to the motherland, as many people call it. I thought I'd also talk about how these fabrics also can be used as commemorative fabrics. I mean, like a lot of people now, and this is something that happened historically, could actually get chiefs or leaders or presidents' images actually printed onto the fabrics to, again, to, you know, either sometimes during elections, sometimes if somebody has died, And so, you know, it got to the point where it can also kind of be used as a propaganda tool, and you find like a lot of politicians actually getting people to, like commissioning people to make specific fabrics so that they can be worn, or like people can wear them and, you know, show that they have support for certain politicians, which, you know. But this is something that I think started quite a while ago, and let me just try and see. This is not the best image, but this is actually, the fabric has images of King George, and I think that the British also saw like the powerful tool that these fabrics have in terms of communicating something orally, and whether it's true or false, or but they do communicate something. So they were now making fabrics at some point that had images of queens and kings, you know, colonial kings and queens, and selling them through the markets, which is interesting. Yeah, so I think I'll end there, and just with, you know, this is an image from Vlisco that has all these pattern designs, and the way that they like sort of lay out their designs is something that's like, of course, becomes very different once it leaves the Netherlands. And, you know, maybe I'll just add that even up to now, if you go onto the Vlisco website, they, as much as like, you know, they're selling these fabrics to the African market, I also feel that they don't have much control with what happens once it reaches the continent. Excuse me. And so they're really actually soliciting like a lot of people to tell them stories and tell them the importance of all these designs that they have. But it's again pretty problematic, because it's gonna change so much depending on where you are. So if you put an image out there and ask, what does this mean? You know, somebody from Ghana, somebody from Togo, somebody from, you know, even the DRC will have completely different understandings of it, because it's so based within the local symbologies and, you know, the history of those symbols within those specific cultures. So it's, I think, something that's always still being sort of negotiated, and once they see that something is like kind of popular, then there is also this idea of trying to sort of control that story, or and it's just something that's not going to be possible, because they just keep traveling and traveling, and, you know, newer generations start to wear them and they take on newer meanings. So it's not something that can really be pinpointed into this one thing necessarily. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting, the context that you present, and also interesting because in this morning we were at a workshop with Abdoulaye Konate, and we discussed exactly this. And he was stating how, well, it doesn't matter, you can never control this kind of symbology, because it's the way that people use it in the end that, you know, will give the meanings to these pieces. So thank you very much.
Hello. 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 Thank you, Sabrina, for the introduction. As an artist, I've been engaged in different creative activities dealing with contemporary social issues and urban situations in different contexts. I am very much interested on better understanding the shifting or changing moments of urban spaces, and also the effects that might be created, you know, just in the people's life. As I am also associated with an educational institutions in the arts, I always try to generate possibilities for students to engage beyond, you know, just their formal educational activities. But today, I'm not going to talk about myself or my artworks, nor the institution. Instead, I thought it would be much more interesting to talk about the context in which I work, and also to give you an insight about the urbanization activities and the strange urban experiences happening in Addis Ababa, particularly, but it can also be shared by different city spaces in different African countries, and also in any developing city spaces and places. For that, I have selected a few images, and I'm going to talk about the story behind the image and the existed and existing urban experiences in Addis. The image that you see is a close-up shot from the demolishing construction site. It's common in any urbanization or the so-called modernization activities. People are usually displaced, and old settlements are in charge or just subjected to be demolished. So what you see is like it's almost becoming an everyday experience in Addis Ababa to see such demolishing construction sites. But the strange part is that in such old form of settlement, the dynamics of the social, how do you call it, interaction and the way how they can make a living is somehow informal. But after people like displaced from their old spaces, they are relocated in a new condominium buildings outside the city. So it's really creating a huge frustration through the people that are already moved or relocated, and also the people living in their own situation, because no one knows what's happening in the next day. This is one of the few sites where displaced people are relocated. As you can see, it's really far from the city, and they are also far from the basic elements that they know, just how to make a living out of their settlements. So it's really creating, especially in the young generation, it's really creating a depressed and very slow kind of generation, which will definitely affect the collective becoming. In all this removed or demolished areas, it's really becoming normal to see new construction sites, and high-rise buildings are built in the last like 6-7 years, very, very rapidly. And one of the strange things in Addis is it's always important to question, whose modernization, because every cultural landscape requires its own kind of code and understanding or translation of this idea or practice of modernization. The number of glass and aluminum glazed buildings are becoming very high these days in Addis Ababa, and at the same time, it's possible to say that the sun is always, almost throughout the year on the sky. But this glass and aluminum glazed buildings are like affecting the temperature of the city, and that we are experiencing every day. This is a picture that I took from the so-called poor neighborhood, and it's really common to see such kind of dishes everywhere. But particularly such kind of dishes are only transmitting entertainment channels. So you can see that more than half of the people in the city are like consuming unnecessarily, but at the same time, massive amount of information that doesn't really have any relevance to maintain and negotiate their own life, and just individually and in a societal level. For the last 3 years, this thing worked properly. In the last 3-4 years, the government has been constructing railway roads in the city. And there are like many strange happenings occurred already during the process. But I really want to mention one thing, that during the process of this railway construction, there were like 20 old historical houses demolished. These houses are not only just old or historical houses, but more than 20 houses which were already registered, formally registered as a heritage to be preserved. But it seems that just no one cares about the traces of our own history, instead like engaged in the so-called modernization activities. This is one of the squares, very, very important squares for the history of the city and the inhabitants. It was called before Maichao Square, and during the Italian occupation in Ethiopia, the imperial was like presenting a speech in the United Nations just to claim that the occupation was really wrong. And at that time, one of the few countries supported Ethiopia was like Mexico. So this square was called Mexico Square. And it was there for a very, very long time. And it really represents the collective memory of the city dwellers. But through this railway construction, this space was required, just during the process. So it took them only 2 days to demolish not only the square, but also the monuments, which was there for a very, very long time. So you can also see that the collective memory doesn't really have a place during this distorted form of engagement in modernization activities. This is a square called Takla Haymanot Square. But under the name of like beautifying the square, the space was given for an international company, Samsung. So this is like a kind of monument that Samsung put it in this square. But at the same time, this particular square had a very intense social history that is very important for the people. So the person that you see in the foreground of the picture is an artist who is like performing in that space, dressing like an Ethiopian old warrior, and claiming the space for the collective memorial representations. That's a park in the very center of the city. It didn't really have that much clear name before. But this space was recognized as a public park space in 1963, and then since then until 2004, it was really functioning, organically functioning very well for the everyday activities of the people. And in 2004, the government or the state named this particular public park as Africa Park, and gave it to one Ethiopian billionaire under the name of like development. So they said that the park space will be developed, and then will have more or productive function to the public. But strangely, with a strange reason that no one knows until present time, this park space has been fenced and gated since 2004 until the present time, and no public has the access to use it as a public space, just to mediate and maintain their personal and collective relationships. When it comes to Africa, it's really common to have like open markets, and it's really functional for the society to buy things in not a cheap but reasonable amount of money in a very convenient kind of manner. So Ethiopia has one of the biggest open market in Africa, which is called Mercato. It's the Italian name. And it was really very important spot just for centuries, in which especially the middle class and the low class people purchase whatever they want in a convenient kind of manner. And also the interaction that happened in the everyday life has been really constructive in a societal manner. But since recent time, the government, the state is like started to sell the land. Just in our constitution, the land belongs to the state. So the state is like selling just some parts of this open market. So now it's obvious to see construction sites in this, in here and there in the open markets. And many of the signs and the buildings are intended to be a kind of shopping mall. So I don't think that just many people who are really functioning here will function after a few years when this open market is occupied by the shopping malls and such expensive capitalist kind of formats. So I think this is my last image. This is like the context in which I work, and I do really also understand that it's really important for an artwork to occupy such kind of everyday spaces, especially in a developing kind of city spaces and places like Addis Ababa. Thank you.
Thank you, Berhanu. Thank you. I think it's turned on.
Hello? I think it's not working. Okay, we can share it, yeah. So don't interrupt me. So yeah, basically, thank you, Sabrina, for putting this panel together, and Kelly gave us a great introduction, a little bit about, a particular community or the importance of one good. You were talking a little bit about, the city and the urban space that you work in. So what I want to do is something else, in particular talk about some of the exhibition projects that Sam and I have been working on over the past few years. And in particular, I want to talk a little bit about 4 different shows and 4 different strategies, how you can actually engage with community or the public, so to speak, within the format of an exhibition that is taking place within a traditional or conventional museum space. I actually strongly believe that it is not so much about where you show art, but really very much about how you show it and how you conceive a project, and that it is always important, whatever project you do, that you think about the audience and that you try to connect and engage as many people as possible in these projects. But I still also believe that they can and often are very well suited in a traditional museum or in a traditional exhibition space. And I want to give a few examples here. This is from one exhibition that was done in Gwangju in South Korea. And the museum had approached us to do an exhibition basically on Middle Eastern art, which is always a bit strange when you have to curate a region, and oftentimes artists fall then into this role of being cultural ambassadors of sorts, and they need to represent a region, a culture, a history, or certain political problems, tensions, and things that you see. But what we wanted to try and do here is actually avoid this altogether. And instead of just doing some sort of, survey show representing a region, we wanted to create a fictional narrative that was connecting with a story that is local in Korea, in the place of the city. We took the metaphor, or we took basically the story and the lives of 2 very iconic singers, one that used to live in Cairo, Kulthum, and one that used to live in South Korea, originally near Gwangju, called Lee Nan-yong. And both of these singers were really iconic singers, not only in their cities, but in their regions. The countries had maybe similar political systems and political conflicts in their histories, somewhat in parallel. But we created a narrative that talks about a fictional encounter of these 2 singers in 1967. These singers were both in Paris, giving very important iconic concerts, but they actually never met. And we took this kind of encounter as the metaphor or an entry point for this exhibition, and saying now the artist or this dialogue on music is kind of continued. So as if, Lee Nan-yong was inviting Kulthum to go to South Korea. So the central theme of this exhibition was actually based on music, and we wanted to use that as an entry point or as the common thread for all the artworks in the show, which is something that you can relate to in a very universal way. When you listen to a piece of music, it is not something that people try to analyze as much as when you look at a piece of contemporary art. Music is really universally understood. You listen, you have an emotional connection with it that is immediate and free from all kind of cultural connotations or interpretations. When you look at contemporary art, it's often the case that an artist needs to solve a conflict, talk about a war, or talk about something that is more about the general politics. So the entry piece here was a piece that we commissioned by a Lebanese artist, Rad Yassin. And he basically, this is the portrait or famous iconic image of Kulthum, the singer in Egypt. But she basically here sings some Korean songs. And this was the entry point in it, which of course is not possible. You know, she didn't speak Korean. But it was something that these songs kind of, mix a little bit the two cultures, if you will, as an entry point. Here we have an installation by Munir Fatmi. It's called Saving Manhattan. It's a soundscape by all these different speakers. But at the same time, the lighting and the shadow creates a skyline of Manhattan before the 9/11 attacks. You see these two taller speakers on the left. They resemble something like the Twin Towers. So even though it's not really showing Manhattan, but it creates that sort of impression as if it was. And the soundscape basically creates sort of this urban landscape behind it. This is an artist from Tunisia called Nee-San Constantini. This is also a very sort of more sound-based work looking at missing people that have disappeared and died in the past. It's not necessarily about conflicts, but it is something that, is sort of just this, looking for people or something. It's almost a bit ghostly when people passed away, and the sound was something that was a work also that was readily accessible. In the center, we created a round mini theater. It looks a bit narrow here. I guess the picture got screwed. But you could go in there, and there were really short clips from the two singers. This is Kulthum, before we had Lina Nyong. Kind of placed them in the center of the exhibition. We also included works by Zineb Sedira. This is again a sound piece. You see this close-up of these two ships on the left or in the middle in the back there. And in Korea at that time was this sinking of that ferry ship, the Sewol ferry, which was really, really shaking the country and the political systems and the faith in non-corrupt, organization of political structures to the core. So this was also a work that we included to kind of maybe make reference in a certain way to current political affairs in here. This is a work by two artists. You have a video installation here by Ziad Antar. And by pure coincidence, he actually filmed a Korean student playing the violin that plays a very iconic song by Kulthum. So this was pure coincidence when we found this work. But it is a Korean student playing that song by this Egyptian singer. On the side and the corners, you have works by an artist that is based in the Emirates, Muhammad Kazem, and he has basically transcribed sounds into two-dimensional planes. So it's a very minimal work that you can't really quite see, but as you went into this particular gallery here, it sort of became like almost an orchestra of sorts. I'm just going to finish with this image here for this show of two artists, Rada Ahmed and Manal Dowayan. So this is another project that we did in Beirut in 2013 on a modernist painter, Paul Giragossian, who died in 1993. The show was really the first big retrospective of his work and his life, and it happened in Beirut. He is an artist that actually is of Armenian descent. The family, part of his family fled the genocide in Armenia, then settled in Jerusalem, but had to leave Jerusalem also, and finally settled in Beirut. So they were part of a very noticeable Armenian community in the city of Beirut and in Lebanon. And we worked very closely with the family who has been collecting archives and materials about this particular artist, and visited a lot of the places that the artist would go to. This is an image of one of the main streets in Burj Hamid, Arak Street. It's a sort of the big sort of central axis, if you will, where a lot of Armenian Lebanese gather, where they buy, where they meet, etc. And it was really amazing to see when you go to these shops and you mention the name of the artist Paul Giragossian, how many people would have personal stories and met him. He was very much a people's person as an artist while he was alive. And we took that a little bit. This is one of the bakeries where people would met him. This is him. Some more pictures in the studio. And we really created, instead of just hanging the pictures, an exhibition that was really based on this idea of him being in a certain community. So we have here a central circular room. He was also a theater practitioner. There was an image with Jalal Khouri, a famous theater person in Beirut. And here, this is a theater stage that he had created, but the other panels were actually lost. So we created a sort of central room, and around we placed a lot of the artworks, like drawings or scenes of the markets that we had created. So it's sort of a public space. And what was very important is actually create this big archive room. So with the foundation and with all the research that we have been doing for a few years, we created not only just a timeline, but also a lot of visuals and images that you can see here, film clips, all sort of documents. And the effect of this was really that it became really also a bit of a meeting point, the exhibition. It wasn't really just about the artworks, but it was very much about personal stories. It was about exhibitions that people had recollections of, photos that they recognized or things that they had contributed to it. And the idea was really very much also to tell a story of a city, a history that is maybe lost, much more than simply presenting the artworks, but really go one step further and make it something that is more about a larger community at this particular time. This is another project that we did in New York in 2009, and it is about some mix of disciplines as another strategy. This is an exhibition where we, on the 30th anniversary of the so-called Islamic Revolution in Iran, that happened in 1979, and in 2009, we put together an exhibition of 56 artists from Iran. Half of them were living inside the country in Iran, and the other half was in the diaspora, mostly in the US, but also worldwide. And from the beginning, we felt to somehow represent the very rich art scene and the young, dynamic art history in the country, not only by showing visual arts, but also bringing film and music, dance, and all those things into one comprehensive project. The museum was a very open kind of space on the ground floor. It's a big, maybe a bit like the Seski, the new space that you have for Video Brazil. And we worked from the beginning, from the conception of the exhibition, with a ballet company based in New York called Cedar Lake, to create and choreograph some improvised promenade dance theater, if you want. So these performances, and I'm going to just flick through these slides really quickly, ended up relating in many ways to the artworks. They're a bit dark. This is maybe hard to see a little bit. I hope you can get a bit of an idea. Related in a very direct way to the artworks. And this dance performance did not take place in a separate theater, but actually in the exhibition itself. So what we're trying to do here is to create a direct merger of dance, music, and the visual arts by creating one comprehensive installation. We also had a very extensive series of public rehearsals. So they just took place during regular opening hours of the museum, and people would stumble across them accidentally. We had some that were timed specifically, so people could attend these open rehearsals. And of course, then there were the actual dance performances. And you see in the back here, the visitors were not separated in any way. The performances, the dances moved throughout the entire building on the 2 floors. And yeah, that was a little bit, what we were trying to do here. And it actually was definitely wasn't quite as dark actually in this space as it looks here. So the last example with which I want to conclude is an exhibition that is called Tea with Nefertiti. It started in Doha, went to Paris and several other museums in Valencia and in Munich, and is going to the US in 2017. And from the beginning, what our idea was here is to actually take a very different departure point on artworks. I think if you have a belief that artworks are somehow universal when it comes to cultures, and that's a starting point that in all our projects we very much start from. That an artwork is first and foremost an artwork and not an anthropological document or a political testimony of sorts. But first and foremost, it is an artwork that you should understand for what it really is. Then this belief, I think, also needs to come with that art is kind of timeless. That art is, in a sense, that's the wrong image here. but that art is really always contemporary of sorts. So an artwork, even if it was created, 500 years ago or anywhere else, was contemporary at one point. And it needs to, I think, also be understood from a certain different perspective, rather looking at it as an anthropological document. And what we did here is taking a period that we have a particular interest in research, which is modernity in the Arab world, in particular Cairo, Lebanon, which is where we've done a lot of research. And this is, if you want, the departure point for this bigger project, which looks at how artworks end up having to represent different cultures. And I'm going to really quickly, so the exhibition is quite complex, look at some examples here by mixing these different times. For example, ancient Egyptian artworks, which we see here, and juxtaposing it with a piece by an Egyptian modernist, Mahmoud Mukhtar. We see that the artist, and this is on the left and on the right, took an ancient pharaonic artwork as a very direct example. Oh, they're all messed up. Is there a way to go back on these or not really? Yeah, they're all mixed up a little bit. It's not a big deal. I can... This one? Okay, I actually need to go forward, sorry. Here's another example. It's not so clear. Here we have a statue of Giacometti, for example, who was actually doing exactly the same thing. He was looking at ancient Egyptian artworks, pharaonic artworks, and really was considered a great master. So in a lot of our research, when we found exhibition documents of an artist like Mahmoud Mukhtar, who also spent time in Paris, when he was exhibiting his artworks in the 20s in Paris, for example, the connotation contemporary Egyptian artist was really always imposed on him and his artworks. And the interesting thing is that this leads to a reading that is more based on traditions or tribal art, if you went, or some folk art, when other artists, like whether they are Modigliani or Giacometti, those big famous names, did exactly the same thing. They were considered then the great innovators and the great masters of their trade. When someone that was based in Cairo or in Paris even, but of Egyptian origin, were doing the same things, end up being just considered as folk or as kind of not so relevant artist, if you will. This is an image of surrealism here. I want to give you another example, which is quite central to the construction of this exhibition. It looks at three different artworks that seemingly look the same. We have on the left a ceramic vase by Ai Weiwei. It's an ancient Neolithic pot, a few thousand years old. Ai Weiwei painted Coca-Cola on it, and now it's considered a contemporary artwork, fetching 500,000 or so in an auction, when before it was just an ancient old piece of clay. In the middle is an artwork by Grayson Perry. That's an artwork, it was created a few years ago, a British artist that works a lot with ceramics and tapestries. So it is an artwork that looks old, but it's actually contemporary. And on the right is a vase from the Museum of Islamic Art. It's an object that is classified as Islamic art. So it is actually an ancient artwork that is still considered an ancient artwork. Now, why is this so interesting? It is really, it's a shame that the image is not so clear, but when you see these three artworks, the one that is most easily readable is the one on the left when you look at the Coca-Cola vase, because it is an image or an icon or a logo that is so current in our contemporary culture. So we kind of understand immediately what is happening in here. When you look at the Islamic vase, it's some old pot and it carries this title Islamic, so it's already loaded with a lot of images and loaded with a lot of preconceived notions. But when you actually go closer, you see in here, this is a vase that shows scenes from 12th century Damascus, and you see that there are a lot of Christian motifs in it, because these communities often were more mixed. So, but it shows something very contemporary about how people were living together actually in this particular period. But it is harder to actually access it and see what is the story that this artwork can actually tell us. It's mostly just grouped in a particular difference. So what I think we're trying to do here in this particular exhibition is to really question a little bit these boundaries. Where is an artwork from? What does it mean? How is it classified? And challenge a little bit how you access the understanding or the comprehension of this artwork. When you really think that all artworks have the power to be contemporary of sorts, then I think it is very important to really approach it free from all time-based classifications, art historical classifications, and geographical classifications, and try to understand where does the artwork come from, how has it traveled, and how has it been exhibited. And I strongly believe that this can actually yield to very new insights here. This is an image from the Egyptian Museum in Munich, where we actually installed this neon here by Maurizio Nanucci. This bold neon logo, all art has been contemporary. You see ancient Egyptian art. You see also a photograph by Yusuf Nabil of the Nefertiti statue. And yeah, that's what we were trying to do with this particular show, crossing disciplines, and hopefully people that only have an interest in one or the other, trying to engage in some sort of dialogue of disciplines, which I believe is often actually missing. Okay. Oh, actually, I want to, very importantly, this is a piece by a Palestinian artist, Nida Sinokrot, that was here also in the Egyptian Museum in Munich. It's depicting an ancient pharaonic gesture called a car gesture, symbolizing the moment where, you know, somebody goes up in heaven. It's a motif that was also adopted by Christianity of some sort of prayer gesture. But what I really wanted to say, this is a piece that comes from the Sharjah Art Foundation. It was commissioned. So so wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Thanks, Till. Thanks, Sabrina. I'll just wait for my slide. Thank you all for being here. It's a privilege to be here, and I want to thank Teresa and Solange as well for inviting us. I decided to have way too many images. I'm going to flick quickly, but I wanted to give you an idea of what an institution that's funded by the government, what their role is to the community. So foremost, we're a public institution, so we have to think of where we are, the community that's around us. So I decided to choose images from my phone, from Instagram, of our neighborhood and how people are related to the area we're in. Sharjah Biennial actually started in 1993, and it has a long history in the region for a lot of artists coming from different parts of Sudan, Egypt, other Arab countries participating in it. And in 2002, I took over as role of director and decided to take it out of the experience of an exhibition in an exhibition hall and put it in the city, in an area known as the arts area since the 1980s. And then we started doing a lot of projects with communities and education programs, residencies, that it became too much of a load for the biennial to handle. So we formed the foundation in 2009, but we were still a biennial every 2 years, which was a little bit difficult. So like Video Brazil, they have to start again every couple of years. And in 2009, we started the foundation and building our own spaces for year-long activities and exhibitions. So you can see we are in the old part of Sharjah. It's, if people who don't know, Sharjah is right next to Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. And it's the only emirate that has 2 coasts, so the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman. And we are in the old part that is over. We have maps of the area from 1820 that show the buildings that we inhabit, and there's one of the oldest mosques. And the community, everything we do at the foundation, including education programs, are free and open to the public. So that really mixes our community. When people say, "Who is your audience?" You know, it's from the baker next door to the sailors that dock ship to the university professors, artists, students, everyone. This is the Emirates Fine Arts Society right next to our foundation office, which was founded in 1980. There is a long history of the art scene in that area, and it was important for us to stay in that area as well. Sorry about the quality, they're just from my phone. Here's a project from Stars and Tartars from the biennial, Sharjah Biennial 10 in 2011. And again, we are next to very important Iranian mosques, and a lot of the themes that they deal with, the artists deal with, relate to Shia culture. So having these works close to the places where people can relate to them and ask questions is also very interesting for us. Sometimes we do a lot of public projects, but we don't necessarily keep them or save them because we like to keep the environment changing and creating new public works. At the back, you can see a little bit of Ernesto Nieto's structure, and in the front, an oasis built by Kirsten Gears, David Van Severen, architects who were invited by Yuko Hasegawa for Sharjah Biennial 11. There are 3 oases that were built for the biennial, but this one, due to the requests of the mosque next door, this building next to it is an old mosque, they asked us if we could keep it for them to use because there's a water fountain, shade, seats. So it's really interesting that a lot of what we do is in response to what the public ask us to do. A lot of artists spend time and research Sharjah when they come, and one of the projects by Shimabuku for the same biennial was to take people on these little boats that go across to the other side where the warehouses are and experience the route that a lot of the sailors take to go back to the docks. And you get to the other side and buy ice cream and come back. So it became a great way of visiting the city, just taking the little boats across. And it was great for the people who run this because they make a bit of money from all these biennial crowds that come and visit. So that was good. And then we used the boats again for the biennial this year. Here you can see artist Nikhil Chopra. We went on the docks to visit another performance on the other side of the docks, and you can see that same mosque. I'm just trying to give you an idea of our neighborhood. That's the performance that was on the other side of the docks by Uriel, Berhanu, and Intisar, and some other dancers. Another project that started in 2009 for the 9th biennial was by Artists Camp. And what they did is research the sailors, the route of the sailors that come and dock their ships right next to our offices. So it was a long-term project with the sailors. And they wanted to develop this project even further, and through applications to our production grant, which we have open to international artists, every 2 years they applied and they got the grant to produce this film called From Gulf to Gulf to Gulf, which was premiered at Documenta. And we decided to screen it at the end of the market on a wall next to where the ships dock again. So people were coming from the street, people were crowding, and because it was shown every day, a lot of people who knew the film from watching it one day would come back again and again throughout the 3 months. So there's another view from the actual market of people just leaving the market and stopping to see the film. We do performances in public spaces as well. So this one is on the beach, just on a public beach. So people passing by just started crowding around and watching the performance. Installations in public spaces are again important. This is the local market. This is the installation by Jesus Negron, Bubu, and it's about the use of cigarette butts to create this kind of decorative object, which are rugs, and they were all over the city. There were quite a few of them. Another project for Sharjah Biennial 11 was a park created by Superflex. This is called The Bank, and it turned this public space that's in the middle of a busy street into a little park or a garden for people. What they did is they asked the local community about pieces of public furniture that remind them of their hometown. So you have slides that are from someone's childhood in Pakistan, beach seats from Malaysia, so from all over the world, but bringing this mixed cultural community back in the form of one public park. And I have to say the United Arab Emirates is a very multicultural place. The population is very mixed. So it was really about engaging with the different communities there. We have conferences. So this is where the Olds area is, and again, a public installation in 2009 by artist Maider Lopez. This area is known for children playing cricket all the time, but she decided to put a football field there for them to play. And this was one of the pieces that stayed for 4 years. Usually we leave it 2 years until the next biennial, but it stayed a lot longer than that. And it's an old picture, I'm sorry, but now the buildings are ready, but these are our new Sharjah Art Foundation spaces. So like Video Brazil, we have a space that's year-round, which really helps us have a community that can come and visit all year round and have exhibitions and programs. And Sharjah Biennial 11, a pitch-at-pong versatile designed with Ole Shireen, a open-air cinema for us. And we continue to use it till this day. Every 2 weeks we have a film program. And we do have to cancel when it rains. It does rain, believe it or not. And it's important for us at the foundation to move out of the city and focus on the whole emirate of Sharjah. And as I said, it's the only one that has 2 coasts. So this is the east coast of Kalba. I've been for the last 4 years on scouting missions, finding old buildings that have been abandoned and trying to save them from, development or demolition. And this is a building from the 1970s. It's an ice factory. It's called the ice factory because fishermen started selling ice there, but it was built as a fish feed factory. And it was never used. It was built and abandoned. So we actually sold all the equipment inside to raise money to fix this project together. Sorry, I've got 10 minutes. Okay. And this year for the biennial, Adrian Villaroja did an installation there, which is still there and kind of slowly decomposing. And what's important is that even the local communities, these are little towns and villages. They don't even have a shopping mall. They have little supermarkets, a market, but at the same time, they have these installations happening there, and it's really bringing a lot of focus to this small town. And for me, I always get frustrated where everybody has to go to the main city to see something of good quality. So it's about bringing people from the other side as well. So I had to put these pictures, I'm sorry. I quite like them. So. And another space is the cinema in another East Coast town, which was built in the 70s, abandoned in the 70s. It took me 4 years. I finally have the keys to this place. But we used it 2 years ago for a project by Shazia Skandar, where she took photographs of the caretaker of the cinema and did an animation. But when we get these buildings, we do complete studies and archive material, ask the public to send us information of their memories about these spaces. So we document them as historic objects. That's the Flying Saucer, which was a building from the 1970s that was built as a co-op. And then a few years ago maybe 6-7 years ago, became like a fast food chicken place. And 4 years ago, the foundation took it over. But we used it for the first time for this biennial with an installation by Hassan Khan, which you can see. This is the newest space that was just given to us, and it turns out this building was going to be demolished. It's the old radio station from the 70s, but the building was built by the British when they were there in the 1930s. We're still cleaning up the space, but it's in the middle of a very busy city center, a very residential area as well. So it's very exciting, and we do a lot of interesting web radio things that we could also host in there. Again, this is a project for Sharjah Biennial 8, looking at solar panels and providing fresh water in a school in the central region. So the central region is also another farmland area, again, leaving out the city. And another thing I like to stress is that every year, around the same time as the biennial, maybe a month later, in April, there is a heritage festival that's full, not really of tourists, but the local community. And because our spaces are free and next door, a lot of people just wander in, and they're not necessarily museum goers, but they want to know what's inside. The doors are open, they just come. And it's the same with children. They just come and play outside and visit. A performance on the beach on the East Coast as well. Tariq Atwi also presenting a performance with drummers. So we had drummers drumming all over the city, just without prior notice of where they'll be. They were on rooftops and markets all over the town, and this was the finale of all of them drumming together. And then at the same time, we do workshops for the schools. And this is a school, it's called the Badoon School, which is the people who have no national identity. So they don't really get a lot of opportunities to have these artistic programs in their kind of school, so we invite them. It's an installation by a Pichatpong. And then the curiosity of things happening and coming up. So this was during the installation of Ernesto's piece. And we had a major sandstorm, a major storm that year. And when it collapsed, the public started calling us and saying, when will you put it back up? Because that's kind of a nice thing. Okay, I'll be quick. Again, the public using the spaces, people visiting. It's just lots of children, sorry, my picture. And social media, the importance of social media for us as an outlet, because you never know who you're going to address with newspapers or TV, and billboards are always very expensive. So for us, social media has literally tripled our audience, and it's helped us really reach out to different communities. There's an installation by Hoor Al-Qasimi, which I decided I want to have it outside in the public space, because you can't really see in this picture, but the buildings are all coral walls, and we like to do things site-specific, because if it's sometimes just in a black box, it might as well be anywhere in the world, and it's about bringing something into the context of where you are and creating things for the public. I think I'm nearly done. We also created a community garden, and this is the market where that cigarette rug was. What we did is we invited all the market sellers and people who live in that neighborhood for a meeting in the market to discuss this garden. What do they want as a community out of this garden? And so it was a space that we had, and I felt I need to keep it active in a way. So we created this market. We had a farmer's market so people could come and sell things, and they do education programs there. And you can see just lots of education programs. An installation by a project we do called the March Project, where we invite young graduates and artists from different parts of the world or universities to come together, meet. We do workshops for them, and then they have to create something site-specific. This is a project by Gary Simmons. For this biennial, we created a cricket stadium outside our spaces, and Sharjah has a long history of cricket, as it was the place that was a place where India and Pakistan could play on neutral ground. So the local people don't play cricket, but half our population is South Asian, and Sharjah is very well known for cricket. This is a performance by Papi Abatani with local musicians that happened this year as well for the biennial, and it started in the square and became a procession into the street, so people slowly joined this procession, and it's again about bringing cultures together that have some kind of historic relevance. There. So these are pictures from the public's Instagram. I like to kind of see what people enjoyed. A performance by Nikhil Chopra that started really discreetly. Nobody knew, or it wasn't announced. He was just sitting there getting ready for his performance. So, and then that's the end of the performance, walking down. And then he did a workshop with local students where they dressed up in black and had to do this performance in the square. And then just to show you the works through spaces where people move and interact. We do tours for different institutions, and the police also asked us for a tour, so that was really nice. Where we work with different departments, it's always give and take, so they help us with organizing things, and we help them, and we give them tours. So it's very much a city process when things happen. And again, a lot of the education programs with the Centers for Disabilities, children, all ages. We do a lot of filmmaking courses. Drawing. And the importance, again, of social media. These are images from our current exhibition that was on tour from the Hayward Gallery. And seeing the same people and coming back and interacting with works and the comments that they get. So we should go again, we should see this. It's a little bit of a stalking, but I think for me it's helped me understand my public. You know, I can't just be sitting at the desk and not knowing who these people are who are visiting the exhibition. I think I have to say I know most of them now. And again, what I started to do is use the public's images to announce things that we're doing. So I would say these are the public's images. You have, 3 more days before the biennial ends, and they're interacting with the works in such an interesting way. I think it makes it more human, more approachable, and less of artists for the elite. And we hosted the Insta-Meet, the worldwide Insta-Meet this year, and it was a very big, it was very successful. And I think, and then the Project by Soy project in the center, and just more neighborhood pictures, just so you get a feeling of where we are in Sharjah. And that's it. Thank you. Am I on time? Okay.
Thank you so much, you all. It was very, very interesting panel. And actually, I think one transversal question to all of you, I'm taking words from your presentation, Till, the idea of local resonance and local communities. I mean, you all have that in common, either in your research or in your practice. I think this is very, it really came out from your speeches. And actually made me think of the current CIMAM, the next CIMAM meeting. The CIMAM is the International Community for Modern Art Museums. And every year they gather, it's a very important meeting where museum directors from all over the world join in a different city and to discuss, themes and questions which are important for art museums. And the theme this year of the conference, which will happen in Tokyo, is what is a global art museum? What is a global museum? And actually, when I read that theme, I thought, well, it's really important that we keep on discussing the idea of the global art, and local and global. But I think that what would be a conference where we would discuss what is a local museum, what local museums can be. So it's really interesting because it's the idea of addressing, the local context, and it's a challenge, I think, for all of us that work with art every day. The question of the audience, how do we engage with the audience? And I think, it's a huge challenge, either in Brazil, in everywhere, every country. And I've prepared a few questions for all of you before opening to the audience. So I'm going to make the 4 questions and then you can answer. So Kelly, the first thing, it's a comment, because when you discuss, Dutch fabrics and, the tension between this idea of the fabric and the idea of an African tradition and how it puts, this idea of Africanness and African tradition into question, it made me think of the idea of African art, Is there an African art? And how the category of African art is also Western construct, So it really made me think, that through this research we are also confronted with this question, how diverse African art is and does it really exist? So actually my question for you, it's related to your work, the work that you are presenting here. I know that you have presented a research, and I wanted to know how does this research influences what you are presenting here at the festival, and if you could talk a little bit more about this work for the audience. And my question to Berhanu, you presented the context of Addis Ababa and the urban transformation, the landscape transformation, and it really made me think of São Paulo as well. Are many things that you present there that we are confronted here as well. And I would want you to kind of discuss how do you address that in your educational project at the school, because you work with artists as well, right? So how is this local context, or how is this urban landscape transformation interferes in what you are discussing in the school? Okay, and the third question for Till. I made a note here. Yes, I'm really curious because you have presented a huge array of projects which are very different from each other. And I wanted to know more about your curatorial practice. How do these projects start, yeah, how do they start? I mean, how do these ideas come out, and what comes first? You are invited to kind of conceive these projects, or do they start from a research that you're already carrying on? Okay, this is for you. And for Hoor, finally, I wanted to know more about the context, the local context before the foundation of the biennial. How was it, and how did the foundation and the biennial impacted in the fruition of contemporary art? You know, how did you have something? Did you have other institutions that worked with contemporary art before? And how was the impact of the creation of the biennial and the foundation? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm trying to remember my question. So I think it's about the work, and just to talk about the work. Okay, so I think that there is different entry points to my work, and specifically when I'm using these fabrics. You can enter it through the understanding of the symbology, and you can enter it through sort of this flattened idea of what Africanity is. And I think because also there is a added layer of using bleach on this fabric, you can also enter it through the ideas around bleaching, and particularly bleaching one's skin, the ideas around social purity, which is linked, of course, with whiteness. So I think that there's definitely different ways to enter the work. It just depends on sort of what you're bringing to it. The research that, or at least what I presented here, was really something, maybe a different direction that I'm moving towards with these fabrics, where it's becoming more important for me to understand how these fabrics function locally, and sort of the micro histories and micro understandings versus sort of kind of stepped away looking at it as, you know, through this sort of binary of colonizer, colonized. So yeah, so I think that what I presented here is trying to really understand how, what happens to these fabrics once they enter the market, what is this history, and specifically looking at trade, because once we start to look at trade, I think that we really realize that there is really nothing authentic to Africa. Like, even the indigenous fabrics that I showed, I mean, where's the silk coming from? Where's the cotton coming from, you know? There is all of these different trade routes that actually makes everything have like a very deep history that I'm really interested in. So yeah, so that's, I mean, a bit about like the presentation. With the work itself, I think that it really tried to bring in like a bunch of different ideas, from trade to you know, ideas around social purity. Also, you know, with the awareness of me showing the work here in Brazil, and not, you know, necessarily understanding how people will interact with the fabrics themselves, but I kind of had an idea that, you know, once these fabrics, whether they're going to the States, whether they're going to Canada, whether they're going to London, they also take on new meanings depending on where they, you know, sort of land and stuff. So it's you know, I was sure that there would be a connection with this fabric somehow, and, you know, Brazil's history of slavery and colonization, you know, made me think that, yes, this is something that's going to resonate here too. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question at all. Okay, I'm trying to remember it.
As you have mentioned it, you know, just it's really obvious that many developed cities has gone through similar kind of processes. But Actually, that should be an advantage in a space like Addis Ababa. You know, just you have some kind of references and you know which works and which is not. But just in everyday life, you know, everybody is affected by, you know, through the process. No matter whether you notice or you care, you just share, you know, the consequences equally. So in the educational platform, such kind of criticality is not that much, I would say, accommodated, you know, just in the formal curriculum. So what we do is, for the last 4 or 5 years, we develop projects, and we collaborate with local and international artists and institutions as well, you know, just to do some projects in the public space that really address such kind of important urban issues in that particular context. So it's really it has been somehow involved in our discussion also in the educational platform. We also just usually develop a kind of discussions, panels, and conference, which one of which is actually just called Future Memories, which was organized, you know, last year in collaboration with one German institution. And anyone interested can also check the content of the conference online, because the publication has already been launched. So it's really there, not in a direct sense, but in some other kind of formalities. And also in the undergraduate programs, you know, just you don't have this much kind of space to discuss critically about such societal issues. So recently we formed, or we established 2 MA programs that has a research kind of format, in a research format. The students are really free and they have their time just to make a research on this very important contemporary social issues, and just to extend and just to inform the undergraduate programs. At the same time, you know, the local art context, it's very important. So we are really working with the local and international artists in different contexts to make this contemporary situations, urban situations in Addis, to the stage, you know, just to have a kind of clear understanding what's happening there. Did I answer it?
So I think your question was about how our projects start and how do they end up. I think it's a little bit, I think Hoor will also, you know, testify to that. When you travel a lot and you see a lot of things, you just kind of accumulate things that you find interesting somehow. You know, there are always several projects that we're working on at the same time, and there are also some sort of fictional projects, I think, that we work on. So exhibitions, they may happen, they may never happen, but they sort of help you think and maybe put things into a certain context. But what I think most of the projects have in common is that they have a very long lead time. You know, they're based on really a lot of research, and by research I don't mean Googling the internet and things, but I really mean going really out there, you know, spending a lot of time, whether it's with the artists, listening to what they have to say, spending a lot of time in libraries. You know, we're mostly based in Munich, where you have the biggest art history libraries in Europe, so it's an excellent place for just going into finding materials. We travel a lot to different venues. An example, you know, we've been working for 4 or 5 years now on a project on surrealism in Egypt. A little preload was in this exhibition, Tea with Nefertiti. It's, you know, going to be published in a proper book, but the exhibition has a long lead time, you know, so this is something that we had discussed, you know, with the deputy director, the now deputy director of the institution for a long time, and she just said that she wants to have it there, and it starts from there and going on an international tour. But these museums have a very long lead time also, so, you know, this has been decided a long time ago, and now it's opening next year, and then it's going on its international tour. But you know, these projects simply can't just come quickly. You know, there's a lot of material. This is, you know, an art. I think, you know, who is also organizing a conference on this topic in Cairo, and this is a period of art history that's a little bit lost. You know, there really are no records, or you can't really find information in a library and educate yourself about it. You know, there are primary materials, including artworks, that are simply dispersed all over the world, and there is no common record of these. So it's really a question of creating a jigsaw puzzle finding, photo albums from people worldwide, connecting who they are, talking to the descendants of members of this group at that time. And that's a process that simply takes several years, It's and you do it as you go along. You don't do it full time because, other projects happen at the same time. So that's a little bit, I guess, how we work. But then you do other works at the same time, when you just go to one library to look at a document that's maybe in, somewhere in Illinois, you're not going to just fly there simply to check out a book or look at a box of documents. You do it as you go along.
Yeah, in a way, is it working?
No, some of them aren't.
I think it is now. No, I asked that because you can really see the research behind the projects that you've presented here. And I think it's a kind of a privilege, I mean, you kind of search that in your career. I mean, each one of us. But I think that having the time to research and to really focus on a theme, it's something that it's kind of rare today, but it's really important.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely key. I mean, I think if you don't do something and really think about how you do it and present it, it becomes very superficial. And I think you cannot have the same resonance. And the key reason, I was running an art museum in New York and Chelsea, and I really felt that it was a burden, actually, to deal with a lot of administrative things. So we made a very conscious choice to work not in institutions, and there were other opportunities that we were approached, but it's been it's a conscious decision to stay independent and have sort of this freedom of thought. I think you need both people in institutions, but it's something that we care about is just to go against these institutions, and whenever there are projects, it gives you the freedom to really dedicate 100% to that. And also, I very fundamentally believe, and I think what Hoor is doing in the Sharjah Art Foundation is an amazing example. I don't know, I've never been to Ethiopia, but I've been many times, and I think, first and foremost, every project that you do, you have to do it for the local audience. There is sort of an international, maybe discourse that is very important to connect to and be part of, and an exchange, and hopefully you have a few international visitors. But that's not your core audience. I think the core audience really is where you do the projects, where you live. How do you engage, and why are they relevant to do them right there? That includes what Hoor was saying, also researching the history of a building, of a venue, which I think is key also to showing something in it, and rather than just using it as some sort of interior design space and throwing a few pieces in there, but to really go very deep and make it deeply rooted. And when you work in an institution and you do projects in other places, it becomes quite hard to dedicate enough time there. I think when you do a show and a project, you need to spend time with the people that are there and dedicate to it. I think it's absolutely important. It doesn't come easy. It's a lot of hard work. But yeah.
Thanks, Sabrina. I have to say, for one, the Sharjah Art Foundation is my baby of 13 years, so it's very personal. I grew up with the Sharjah Biennial in 1993. I was 13 years old. And the Emirates Fine Arts Society also started in 1980 when I was born. So for me, I was always surrounded by art and culture in Sharjah. I became part of the society as the youngest artist at 15 years old. I started teaching after school. So it was very much a community of artists. And in 2002, by fluke, it's a long story, but I got involved in the Sharjah Biennial in between my BA and MA. And what happened was I ruffled a lot of feathers that everybody quit, and I had to do the biennial in 6 months. So for me, there were a lot of things that really needed to be changed. For one, is the idea of national pavilions that we used to have, ambassadors, having their artwork in every single biennial, or the cultural ministers, and it was really frustrating for me after visiting Okwi's Documenta. That's really what kind of changed my career as an artist, then deciding to take over the biennial. And it was a lot of backlash at the beginning. It was the day the American troops marched into Iraq. That was the day of our opening, actually. So there was a lot happening politically. So it was more of a statement of having international art, a lot of performance art happening throughout the city. And it was a bit of a shock, but at the same time, it was very necessary to kind of move away really from the local a little bit, to get this global understanding, this global kind of professionalism and then go back and revisit the local. And I think
it's really attention, right? You have to kind of balance both.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what I tell a lot of people is I'm a product of Sharjah Biennial. So I could put myself in the position of an audience or an artist or the director or the curator, because I've been in every single part of it. And we have different curators every 2 years, but I like to keep the staff, the same staff that we have, because they learn, they grow, and it's really a family. And we've gone from 3 people to 100 people now at the foundation. And our responsibilities are growing each time, but I think it's also the trust that we receive from the community, that they, a lot of the comments that we receive is that, this is our biennial, and I think that's important for us.
Alguém gostaria de fazer uma pergunta?
Good afternoon. My name is Rafael Radi, and I'm counselor of the Creative Economy Department of Fair Comércio to SESC Belows. My question first to everyone is the first time that you are in Brazil, all that are in the podium? If it's not, how is or if it's the first time or the field, not much time here, the first question is, how is your impression in this country concern sculpture in open and public places? I asked you this because we did several projects from Brazilian artists like Elisa Bracher that we moved. She did work in a very large trees that from Amazonas and moved to Germany and Switzerland. And we discovered that here in Brazil, we doesn't have the feeling that a place belongs to everyone, but that a place is nowhere. It's different if you put, like you showed, Honor, concerning Sharjah, that they are involving the people to discussion on it. And so, the second question that I have is concerning global. I'm great thankful to you that you mentioned what happened in Tokyo concerning the Global Museum and the environment as well today. Anthropologically, I see that most artists doesn't have connections in the truth with the actually situation on Earth. I mean, in sense of what she said concerning where the products come from. Nobody knows that most soya beans from Brazil that was produced in central Brazil are moving to China. And how connections is between China and Brazil today in the arts environment of exchange and know each other. The second, concerning coffee, you come from Ethiopia. The coffee Arabica is from there originally, and São Paulo was made or built through coffee trade from inside the country through the highway to the harbor. Today I asked most people here that in Brazil, how is the relation between the products and the origin from the products to where to understand people, to communicate with them. They think global, but they forgot to be what is around and to see the points that connect to them. So these are two questions that I would like to bring to everyone. First, how is your impression concern presentation from new spaces or in Brazil, from your experience, how you see sculpture in the public places here, and compared to our place? And the second one, how anthropologically arts could be global in a sense of conscient ways to realize, to save the world, or to understand, or to care on it. So, I don't know if this is clear.
I think this is a topic for a whole new conference, maybe. But I think to generalize and say that artists aren't concerned is a little problematic, because all artists deal with different issues and their works are different. But as an institution, it's important to make the artist aware of where you are. You know, an artist can't come from anywhere and know exactly the situation of the country they're invited to. So we send them a lot of research material. We have them coming on many trips, you know, throughout the year before. And some artists want to engage with the local, but some don't. And that's not, it doesn't have to be. They don't have to engage with the local. It's our job as an institution to have the mix of works that relate to different issues. We had works that relate to the Arab Spring, which didn't really happen. But, you know, so all these little political issues that are happening around, be it, you know, workers' rights or, you know, migration and a lot of all these issues. Again, I think it's the role of the responsibility. Your question about Sao Paulo, I've visited many times the biennial. This is my first visit to Video Brazil. I think having it in a place where you could see a lot of the community and public moving in, coming, you know, to use the restaurant here or to use the library. And what's great is the video archive that Video Brazil has. It's amazing. It really, just having this platform, even the platform online, is this direct relation between the local and the global.
You cannot find it around other cities in
Yeah.
Brazil, in Cuiabá or in Rondônia. So there is
I've only been to the places I've like in Rio. There's a lot happening in Rio, I know, but I mean I don't, you know, and in Inochim and Belo Horizonte, but other than the art circuit and things that I've visited, I can't really address the local because I don't know the local. I come for the arts festival, it's always busy, and then you have to leave. So I think that question really should be to your local audience, not to us coming in from the outside. Well, I see a lot of people coming to use the pool here that are, and this library I found really impressive inside CESC, the people using this space and end up, yeah, I think it's a lot of the public. And for me, as I said, I wouldn't know if this is enough for you or not, but I think it's really great. Okay. But Dubai is different from Sharjah, so I can't comment. I mean, it's, yeah. Yeah. Yes, yeah, I understand.
People come here is a closed place.
Yeah.
You know, that you feel yourself. Security, you feel you can talk to people.
Yeah.
But if you go in another place,
Well, I see.
Maybe you know, is it your first time in Brazil, right? You all, except from Hoor.
Yeah.
So maybe they don't have, I mean, they've just arrived. It's been a very busy week. I don't know if they would be able to answer that question in such a deep way.
Yeah.
But I don't know, would you like to make a comment on his question or
I mean, I can make a comment on the question. I mean, I think it's also important not to overestimate what art can and can't do. You know, it is never going to be like football.
If it affects
you know,
one person,
yes,
it's
it does the trick already. You know,
yeah.
I think it's not something that you think. I think my first impression. I have been to other countries in Latin America, but this is my first visit to Brazil. I find it highly engaged. You know, you meet a lot of people that are very interested, very curious. I find it very open. I think there's a lot of visionary things. These institutions of CESCIs, I find it quite impressive. I'm sure it's not perfect, and I'm sure it should be more and everywhere else, but I actually find it really unique. We don't have this in many other places that I've visited. I also think this idea of public spaces, you know, when you go to Ibirapuera Park, I think this is very visionary. You know, it's in a public sculpture in itself that had resonated globally also. I think there are impulses coming out of Brazil that are felt everywhere else, you know, in terms of, you know, the social fabric and the engagement with the arts. So, you know, you come here and I think you immediately feel at ease. It's very cosmopolitan, it's very welcoming, very open, very, you know, intelligent, it's sophisticated. You know, I find it's a wonderful experience being here. And I'm sure you can always do more, but I think it's great. Yeah.
Berhanu and Kelly, would you like to comment on this? No? It's really up to you. You don't have to.
Maybe it may not be directly related to the question, but I was like asking some friends that wherever I go, lately I've been traveling a lot. Wherever I go, you get some kind of code for the city, just to understand where you are and just recognize the urban platform or settlement. But here I was really trying. I was expected to remind myself where I am, just continuously. So I was like asking people, what makes Sao Paulo Brazilian somehow? Because I couldn't really find something that makes me able to understand where I am. But finally, just I do really understand the beauty of it. It's diverse, just the people's face that you see is totally different than any other place I know. And the city is also, the structure, the architecture, and just the roads and just everything that I saw is like somehow mixed, which I really found very interesting. That's the impression that I have in Sao Paulo. But about the public spaces and public sculptures, maybe I didn't really give the chance for myself to see. I didn't see that much.
I guess it takes place for everyone to get to know one place better, right? Like everywhere. Does anyone else want to make a question or comment?
Olá, eu queria perguntar para a Kelly. Vou perguntar em português com consideração dos outros amiguinhos.
I can try to do it if you want. It's up to you.
Você entende que a representação dos seus tecidos são uma identidade para o povo negro. Você entende que, após você colocar o seu trabalho à venda, você acredita que haja uma apropriação cultural ou que você esteja um prestígio para o seu trabalho? Como você entende essas duas chaves dessa questão?
Você perguntou como ela entende que o uso dos tecidos seja ou uma apropriação cultural ou...
Como ela entende nas chaves de apropriação, se há uma apropriação cultural quando a venda do trabalho dela,
Uhum.
ou se ela acha isso do trabalho dela e não
You didn't understand. Okay. So he's asking, how do you see the use of I would say, do you see there is a cultural population, or do you see that something but mainly he is stressing the idea of cultural population.
Like if I am cultural ownership. I think that to start with, like the as I said, the fabrics. Oh, sorry.
Okay. The translator didn't translate? Okay. Well, we were trying to figure out. But I think he was, for what we understood, is how does she use fabric in her work? Is it a matter of cultural ownership? And the second part is that it's the thing that we didn't quite get. But she will discuss it now.
I watched a documentary recently where they talked about these fabrics, and they said, one of the things that really resonated to me was that the woman said, "You're not a real African woman if you don't own this fabric." I've never owned this fabric until I bought it for this presentation. So does that make me less African somehow? Is something that I'm always sort of thinking about, because I think that what the issue with what the Dutch did is that it flattens Africa into this one space. But this fabric doesn't belong to anybody, really. I can't say that it's part of my tradition, but once I leave the continent, there is an expectation of me being able to relate to this fabric. And so I'm asking why? Like, why should I relate with this fabric? What does it have to do with me necessarily? What does it have to do with Kenya, where I was raised? What does it have to do with Tanzania, where my parents are from? All of these things come into play because it's been flattened as this idea of a representation of African symbology or just Africanness and stuff. In terms of the second question, which I'm not entirely sure I understood very well, I think that, again, to ask if I'm making a commentary on blackness is a very broad question because whose blackness? Like, blackness is not one thing, you know? Afro-Brazilians in Brazil versus somebody from South Africa or from Kenya, you know, we are two different people with different cultures, with different languages. So I could never claim to say that I'm making a commentary on blackness, really. So, yeah.
Thank you. Uma pergunta ali.
Hi, I'm Thiago. My question is to Till. Till, I thought very interesting your presentation about a tea with Nefertiti. I think that's the name, yeah. And I wonder, I would like just to listen to you more about, do you think there's a limit on comparisons? Like when you are comparing those so-called ethnographic objects or like African material culture with contemporary art, do you think there's a limit, there's a measure, there's a scale, how to compare, what to compare, and if this, in comparing those ethnographic objects with contemporary art objects, do you think it's a possibility of decolonizing the ethnographic archives from the ethnological museums in Europe? Did I make myself clear?
Yes,
yeah.
I think so. I mean, I think these classifications, you know, in particular when it comes to art historical classifications or these isms, you know, and Fauvism, Cubism, and all these isms is pretty much a French invention, you know, from, I would say, maybe the 19th century. This is also sort of the peak of colonial times. And I think a lot of these things do overlap, you know, these ideas of where there is a center and who influences whom are very much political decisions or politically one-sided viewpoints. I think these so-called centers have shifted, and in different parts of the world, in different eras, different places have considered themselves centers and thought that they are the ones that spread the knowledge. Then they declined and so on. But I strongly believe there is a human discourse at the end of the day. You know, it's nothing new for people to talk because we have the internet. I think these discourses have always happened. And what maybe the pace is now much faster than it used to be. But I really strongly believe that, you know, there is no such thing of who did something first and who did something second in a way. You know, it's always some sort of dialogue. So based on that, I also don't think that you can really find any measures of saying what is high art and low art, what's art and what's crafts, for example. I think these lines are very fluid, and the constructed differentiations of these come from maybe the market, they come from general trends. Sometimes in periods, certain artworks have been considered very popular or not popular. In the 1900 or so, the National Gallery de-accessioned a very large amount of paintings from the Reformation period, Dürers and all those things, to make new room for all these exciting new trends that were happening in Paris and other cities. They simply thought these were boring old paintings, and now these are incredibly popular. So do we know really what's going to be of value and of you know, appreciation in 50 years from now? We really don't know. And what I'm, to go back to your question of decolonization and those things, I think these are also, coming at a particular time. I think Egypt in particular, has this problem that, at least I can speak for many European nations, the image that people have of it is one of, mummies and pyramids and things, but not of an actual country with a life and its own history. It's sort of almost frozen in time. And that's one image that was also created actively, politically, by the colonial powers to kind of make a point, it's not really current, it doesn't really have anything, there's some old stones, it's a bit empty, we can come and take whatever we want, and we can sort of rule it, and disregard what amazing cosmopolitan cities there have been. So I think there's so many factors at play, and the key thing about art and classifications is that we're looking at these from our very limited lifespan on Earth. So we think, now this is how it is, and it's always been like that, but it's really very, very transient, and supersedes the artists' practice themselves. It supersedes political systems that exist and don't exist. And I think what we're trying to do is just make a point of that and really rip it all apart and say, look, these are the objects, these are the histories that they can tell us. We can look at how an object was presented as an ancient Egyptian artwork in colonial times. How was it presented later in an Egyptian museum? How does it look like when we look at it in a contemporary art museum? So I think it's not really possible to classify. I think in all the projects that we do is try to just ask questions, and complicate a narrative and raise awareness by the programs and, asking such questions. Why do we understand an artwork in this particular way? So it's always good to just make people maybe be more aware, more cautious about making certain statements and assumptions, because chances are that it's a lot more complicated and a lot less clear than it actually is. So I'm maybe answering with more questions than answers.
My actual question relates to exactly the same example with Ai Weiwei, Grayson Perry, and the 12th century Islamic art vase, but it's more concerned with the curatorial practice and complicating narratives. Because where's the limit, where's the borderline when you create a completely different work with what you did, well, in my opinion, and sort of the original meanings or original set of questions that were addressed by the artist disappear in this kind of curatorial practice and this particular approach. Where do you draw the line in your curatorial practice and just generally?
I mean, I don't think it's a question of drawing lines, really. I think it's a question of maybe respecting if there's an artist that is still alive. We can't ask the person that actually created this Islamic bowl anymore, because he's definitely no longer with us. It was 800 years ago, so it becomes difficult to kind of question when you go back in time. But the other artists that are contemporary artists, it's a question of dialoguing it and talking to them about it. I mean, Grayson Perry is an artist that is exactly doing that. His entire artist practice is about questioning what is high art and what is low art, what is old and how do we read objects and how do we understand them by breaking down these barriers. And Ai Weiwei, does it in terms of the contemporaneity of the object. He kind of, the question is that vase that is Neolithic and has Coca-Cola written on it by him, when was that object made? You can't even really classify that date anymore. So I think the question is for us not really to draw a line, but really keep asking questions and see where does that lead you, while being respectful to artists or the meanings. But I think oftentimes it's exactly these exhibitions that create meaning, and being self-aware of that and self-conscious that you may change is part of that discourse, really. And in Tea with Nefertiti in particular, we showed a number of exhibition catalogs also as objects, and many of those had titles like Unveiled, New Art from the Middle East. That was an exhibition in the Saatchi Gallery, so you look at the Middle East through this amazingly creative, and I'm being sarcastic, title of Unveiled, so let's lift the veil and look what kind of art we find. So I think it's being very cynical, but I think these exhibitions coin terms and coin images. And we also, apart from a number of such catalogs, put our own catalog from that exhibition as its own object within the exhibition, just to kind of reference, we are also now creating a certain narrative, and that's part of it. I don't know if that's answering it.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentations. Thank you so much for debating with us. such an interesting subject. I think Teresa wants to speak to
Sim.
all of us.
Em português. Bom, só alguns recados. Agora, às 17 horas, a gente tem uma performance acontecendo aqui na área da convivência, uma das obras selecionadas e apresentadas aqui no festival. E às 18 horas, a gente volta aqui para o teatro e encerra a noite com a premiação do festival. Estão todos muito convidados. Mas só antes de encerrar aqui a conversa, eu gostaria de falar desse livro, Perspectivas para Outras Geografias do Pensamento, que está sendo lançado agora aqui. Vocês podem encontrar à venda na lojinha do Foyer do Teatro. Esse livro ele inicia uma nova série de livros do festival. Então, esse ano, essa edição, além dos 2 livros que aprofundam as questões das obras apresentadas nas exposições, a gente tem 2 livros, um livro dos artistas convidados e um outro livro que ainda vai ser lançado das obras selecionadas e dos projetos comissionados. Essa coleção Leituras, ela traz para uma plataforma editorial as discussões mais conceituais e teóricas do festival como um todo, que esse ano é essa questão do Sul Global. A Sabrina é organizadora do livro, então gostaria de passar a palavra para ela, falar bem rapidamente do processo de realização e organização desse livro, que está com uma qualidade editorial excelente, super recomendado, gente.
Okay, so very briefly, just the book started on the 18th festival. In a public program, actually, when we had Akram Zatari participating in our debates, and he kind of questioned the whole idea of the Global South and how relevant it is, and that he didn't felt any more attached to this idea in his own work. So there was a huge debate, and we decided to kind of investigate the concept and where did it come from, because through using it and repeating it several times, it kind of becomes an empty concept. So it's really important, not only this one, but all of the concepts that we use in our work really have to be we kind of have to dig and try to find out which are the uses. I mean, where does it come from, and what does it really mean, at least in a certain context. So the whole idea of the book was that. And we did 2 years of research and try to find key authors that kind of treated this subject from different perspectives, and also a historical research in order to find out other affiliations with the idea of the third world and the non-aligned movement, of kind of, tracing back this genealogy, and of course, from a critical perspective, which is very important. Not only authors that use the term Global South in their works, but also authors that question this very idea. So I think that it is a kind of a book in a format of a debate, as a public program, but a written one. So I think that's it. Thank you so much.